Good evening and welcome to Climate Conscious Chats, a co-production of the City of West Palm Beach Office of Sustainability and the University of Florida's Thompson Earth Systems Institute. I'm Elaine with the City of West Palm Beach, and with me tonight is Brian, Stephanie, and Elise from the Thompson Earth Systems Institute. We're excited to bring to you tonight's chat, Food Waste. We've left some important links in the chat box for you this evening and encourage you to take a look. As we get started, we ask that you send us your questions throughout the program tonight using the chat box feature. Tonight's Climate Conscious Chat brings you Ratna Suthar, post-harvest scientist from the Agricultural Engineering Department of the University of Florida. Ratna, what can you tell us about food waste?
Hey, Elaine. All right, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right, you guys can see my correct screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, hi everyone, I'm Ratna. I'm a fourth year PhD student at the Agricultural and Biological Engineering Department at UF. My research focuses on post-harvest losses, and this includes food waste. So that's the topic I'll be touching on today. I'll be sharing some insights from my research and some general information. If you're interested in learning more, you can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or email. I have all my information right there. So just an outline of what I'll be speaking about. I'll be starting off with some big picture overviews about food security and climate change and how food waste plays into this. Then I'll talk a little bit about the physiology behind post-harvest losses. And then I'll end by talking a little bit about my research in tomato post-harvest systems. So let's define what's food security. So food security by the United Nations has been defined as when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and food preferences. Now, some of the challenges in food security right now include the rising global population, which is projected to reach 9 billion by the year 2050. And along with the ongoing challenges of malnourishment and poverty globally, it's one of the most challenging factors in food security. And another challenge is food loss and food waste, which accounts for over 1/3 of the losses in the food system. Food availability and accessibility can not only be increased by increasing the production, but it could also, food security can also be increased by reducing our losses, which includes food loss and food waste. So here today, I'm going to be using the terms food loss, food waste, post-harvest losses interchangeably, but I wanted to go over some technical definitions here. So food losses generally are referred to the losses that occur at the beginning of the supply chain, which is when production, harvesting, and processing happen. And it refers to the decrease in food mass or food quality, as in like the nutritional value, when the food is originally intended for human consumption. And this is mainly caused by inefficiencies in the food supply chains, which includes poor technology infrastructure and logistics. In addition, natural disasters and pandemics can also play a role. Next, we have food waste, which occurs further down along the supply chain at the retail, food service, and household level. And it refers to when food that is fit for human consumption is being discarded. And the reasons usually include oversupply due to markets or individual consumer shopping and eating habits. And lastly, we have post-harvest losses, which include both food loss and food waste. It encompasses both of these, but it refers to specifically perishable commodities, which includes fresh fruits, vegetables, and even flowers. So when we waste food, we're also wasting all of the resources that are used to grow, harvest, transport, and package it. This includes water, and over 70% of the global fresh water is used for agricultural purposes. Here is a picture of tomatoes at a packing house being washed. In addition to water, we have land, energy, labor, money, and a lot of the time and dedication of the farmers that are also being used as inputs to produce this food. And it's important to mention because a lot of the growers are generational producers and they devote a lot of time and dedication to their practices. So what is the relationship between food waste and climate change? Well, when food goes to the landfill, it rots and it produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is even more potent than carbon dioxide. So the EPA has constructed this hierarchy of food recovery. So food recovery is the safe recovery of edible food from all stages in the supply chain, which prevents good food that's fit for consumption from going into landfills and composting facilities in order to redistribute the food to those who are experiencing some level of food insecurity. So you can see here the most preferred method is source reduction, which means reducing the oversupply. And then we have feeding those who are in need using avenues such as food banks, soup kitchens, and shelters. Thirdly, we have using those food scraps to turn them into animal feed. Next, we have industrial uses, so using these to produce biofuels or energy. And then we have composting, which can be put back into the earth as a soil amendment. And as a last resort, we have landfill and incineration. So the subset of food loss that includes fruits and vegetables, which is what my area of research focuses on, experiences 45% food losses. And this changes depending on the area. So in developing countries, food loss happens early on in the supply chain at the production and processing levels because there's improper infrastructure. And then in developed countries like the US and other industrialized countries, food loss happens more at the retail and consumer levels. And you can see in this diagram here where we have denoted the pre-harvest and post-harvest stages, this is for a developed country. And you can see that the losses at the post-harvest level are significantly higher. And with that, we're going to have our first poll question, which should be popping up. And the question is, what fraction of food produced goes into the landfill? Oh, and looks like everybody was listening. All right, so 1/3 and 1/6 are the top answers here. All right, okay. How do I end the poll here? Should I end it now? Okay. All right, so looks like everybody was listening. The answer is 1/3 of the food produced goes into the landfill. So I'm just gonna X out of here and then continue the presentation. All right, so why do food losses occur? Well, fresh produce is alive. Just like us, it undergoes the process of respiration. It releases heat, it can lose moisture, get disease, and also die. So it's important to note that the quality of the crop cannot be improved after harvest. So the quality is determined by how it is when it's harvested. And the goal of research in the area of post-harvest science and post-harvest losses is to help slow down that respiration and aging process using technologies and interventions that can therefore contribute to a longer shelf life. So we're going to talk a little bit about physiology here. As I mentioned before, just like us, fresh produce is alive, so it requires oxygen and it releases CO2. And the most important factor in reducing food losses is maintaining the optimal temperature. So lower temperature generally slows down the respiration and aging processes, but this can also be done by using a modified atmosphere for storage. So generally this includes having an environment rich in CO2. Another thing to consider is the optimal storage conditions with the correct humidity and ventilation to remove certain gases that may accumulate. And then there's a lot of research being done in like treatments and coatings, like edible coatings that can prolong the shelf life. So that's a huge area of research in post-harvest. Next, I'm going to talk about a very important plant hormone called ethylene, which is responsible for the ripening in crops such as tomato. It's normally found in a gaseous form, and usually, I'll talk about this later, but in industry, this is the gas that they use to turn the green tomatoes red whenever they desire. So it is a natural chemical agent. That's what I wanted to convey here. So tomato is actually considered what we call in the class of climacteric fruits. So there's two categories of fresh produce. There's those who are capable of ripening after harvest, which is called climacteric fruits, and tomato is in this category. And then we have those who are not capable of ripening after being harvested, and these are called non-climacteric fruits. And generally, climacteric fruits release ethylene, and this can be detrimental if they're stored with commodities that are sensitive. Yeah, and some fruits and vegetables, such as apples and bananas, produce even more ethylene gases than the fellow climacteric fruits you see there. Next, we're going to talk about food quality, because this is one of the determining factors in food losses. So what is food quality? Well, there are many facets to food quality. There's the physical aspects, which include color and firmness. And in this image here, you see the little tomato being compressed in a lab, which is an instrument they use to measure firmness. They see how much pressure it takes to compress a fruit by a certain length. Another physical attribute is color, which they use some spectroscopic techniques for measuring. Chemical compounds, including nutrients such as vitamins and minerals, are commonly measured using analytical chemistry techniques, including HPLC and spectroscopy. And then we have the sensory attributes, which include taste and smell. And they can be measured in a quantitative way, but they are usually done using taste panels. And so, as you can see, quality is typically measured with destructive techniques. It's very difficult to non-destructively measure them. So that's one of the challenges when it comes to predicting shelf life. It's very difficult because, you know, in order to tell if something has the actual nutrients you think it has, you have to blend it up and put it in a machine. And the end of the shelf life is considered when the product is no longer fit for consumption. And this is a very subjective matter, and that's what makes this a very challenging area. And this is actually what kind of inspired me to continue research in this area, the fact that you can quantify things that are very qualitative. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about the detrimental effects of improper storage conditions. So we talked earlier about climacteric and non-climacteric fruits. And there's another class of fruits that are susceptible to what we call chilling injury. And this is usually the subtropical fruits, including tomato, mango. And chilling injury happens when the fruit is stored at a colder temperature than what is optimal for them. And you can see that in this eggplant here, it produces this kind of like scaly texture. And the thing is that you won't see the effects of the chilling injury until after it has exited the environment where the temperatures were too low. So that kind of has like a delayed effect. So you could take home an eggplant that you saw in the refrigerated section, but when you take it home, you'll see that, you know, after a while it starts showing these symptoms, and that could contribute to, you know, food loss at the household level. Another thing is humidity levels in storage conditions. So fresh produce is typically very high in water content, and maintaining that water content is part of the challenge of slowing down that respiration process. So making sure you store it at the optimal humidity is important. Otherwise, you will see water loss and shriveling, as you see in these tomatoes here. And one last thing to consider when talking about storage conditions is what I talked about earlier, where we have climacteric fruits such as banana and tomato. And when you store them with non-climacteric fruits, it can actually have a detrimental effects on those non-climacteric fruits and hasten their ripening process with the ethylene that they're producing in the air. All right, and now we have our second poll question, which is, what is the most preferred method of food recovery according to the EPA? All right, looks like we have about 60% who have voted, and 61% voted for source reduction, which is correct. Great job. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. And I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is, again, a very big picture view of why food waste is important to consider. So in 2016, the United Nations created a series of 17 goals, which they call the Sustainable Development Goals, as a call to action to have a collaboration between public and private sectors to emphasize the need for increasing the food security and reducing the stress on natural resources. So one of the targets of goal number 12, which was responsible consumption and production, includes food loss and food waste. So it targets to reduce our food waste by 50% by the year 2030. And in order to monitor our progress towards this goal, it's important to quantify. You know, it's challenging to kind of manage and monitor what is not measured. So that's what my research focuses on. I'm focusing on creating a tool, a model to help measure the post-harvest losses that can help monitor our progress towards the goal. And this is a little bit challenging because there's no universal standard way of quantifying post-harvest losses. And also, a lot of this data would have to be sourced from industry. And usually this data is extremely proprietary. So that's one of the major challenges, especially when you're working in a developed country like the US. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, which is focused on Florida tomatoes. And tomatoes are the ideal crop for modeling post-harvest losses because of their complexity and sensitivity to environmental conditions. As I said before, they're one of the crops that are susceptible to chilling injury. And they are very economically important, especially in Florida, because Florida is the #1 producer of fresh market tomatoes, and they really represent majority of the tomatoes on the market. And as you can see here in this diagram, the growing areas are heavily concentrated in the southern part of Florida. And for my research, I was fortunate enough to collaborate with some of the growers in Florida. So the typical tomato supply chain includes that we have a grower who is also a shipper. This is where they're harvested and graded and sorted and packed. And after that, they're sent to a repacker where the products are further refined to fit the buyer's preferences. And then they are shipped to the buyer's distribution center where the tomatoes are packed along with other vegetables, which are then ultimately sent to the outlet, which could either be a retail store, it could be a food service agent. And one thing I wanted to note here, which I thought would be interesting to share, is that in Florida, the tomatoes are harvested at the green stage. And this is because they're more resilient when it comes to all the packing and shipping. They're more resilient at enduring this kind of travel, versus if they were red, they would be much more susceptible to losses. So they are harvested green, and then once they reach closer down to the supply chain, either at the distribution or retailer, they're then gassed with ethylene to turn red. And for my research, we're working on developing a model. And without going into too much detail, but all the boring equations and stuff, the purpose of my model is to take in inputs from producers, which includes their yield, the maturity at harvest, the temperatures at which it's stored at every operation in the supply chain, and the duration of each operation. And the outputs include some sustainability measures, including water and energy use, and the post-harvest losses. And then further down the line, we are looking at some uncertainties in these more biological factors, which include the storage temperature and maturity at harvest, and seeing how they affect the post-harvest losses, and also giving a more realistic estimate, because ultimately, you know, there are several different stages of green tomatoes, and it's hard to know if the correct stage was picked. And if an immature green tomato does go through the supply chain, it ultimately will not ripen properly, and it will be considered loss. So we're looking at how those kind of uncertainties propagate through the supply chain. So some interesting things that I have learned in my research is that the most important factor in the food supply chain is trust. And this is why I've seen that sharing data is not always freely acceptable. And it's definitely one of the challenges that I have encountered. And secondly, it was very surprising for me to see how little data is shared between each operation in the supply chain, including very much the producers. So there's a very large gap, especially academically, between those who do the modeling in terms of more crop growth, and then those who look at the more post-harvest. So pre-harvest and post-harvest are kind of like disjoint in that way, especially in terms of data sharing. And I think kind of incentivizing that kind of sharing of data can promote like a more resilient supply chain. And I think that could be one of the things in the future that we might be seeing more of. So promoting the transparency and traceability of the food that we see, so we know exactly where the tomato we have in our hand was grown. So that's one of the things that I think will really take off. And then I'm going to end with what I think is a kind of a nice infographic, since a lot of us are consumers in the audience. It's important to know how to store the products that you buy properly and kind of not overbuy. And since most of the loss in our developed country does happen more at the retail and consumer stage, I think consumer education will also be something that will be kind of emphasized in the future. And with that, I will end our slideshow here.
All right, Rana, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and taking the time to talk to us a little bit about what you're an expert in today. So if any of our viewers have any questions, please write them in the chat box and I'll ask them on your behalf. Ratna, our first question comes from Darlene, who asks, what would you say the biggest misconception is that people have about food waste?
Biggest misconception that people have about food waste, that it only happens at certain places, like that it only happens at restaurants, or I think the misconception is like where it happens, because it happens in all parts of the supply chain. It happens even on the farm level, the packing house level, and then even there's the different kinds of end users. So this includes schools. Like schools have a high amount of food waste as well. Schools, hospitals, other food service agents, and then retailers is just like one of the places. So I think that would be one of the biggest misconceptions.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Rita, who asks, does the chilling effect make the food inedible?
It doesn't make it inedible, but it does significantly reduce the quality. So as we know, quality is subjective. So it affects the flavor, and it also affects the flavor as well as the nutrients in the product. So it does have an overall detrimental effect. It's not just cosmetic.
Charlene is wondering if you'd be willing to go back to that last wheel again about reducing food waste and just briefly go over it one more time.
Sure. Alrighty. All right, here we go. Yeah, so the parts include to be planning ahead. So having a list of what you want to buy so you don't overbuy, storing the products correctly, cooking the right amount, meaning if it's going to go bad sooner, use that, like cook that part first. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty intuitive, like eating it all, or having leftovers for later, and then recycling what you can't eat, which means probably composting, or if you do any meal preparation, so using those kind of food scraps and stuff if you can for composting purposes. And I think one thing that's not mentioned here, which I think is kind of intuitive as well, is if you're not going to use what you buy, you can also donate it to a food bank, where it can be redistributed.
Our next question comes from Elise, who says, I often see gadgets made specifically for certain types of produce to extend their shelf life, such as herb containers and avocado-shaped containers, etc. Are they at all useful, or will they just contribute to more waste?
That is a great question. First of all, I think it's a great marketing scheme, because avocados are notoriously known for being, being not the right, like, fit for consumption when you open them. It really depends on the product. Honestly, I'm not too familiar with a lot of the gadgets that are out there. But yeah, I can't really say. It would really depend on the product, but I would say most likely not. I would say the best resources for you to figure out how to best store your products are usually those. There's a great website. I think I included it here. It's by Foodprint, and it has like a little table of how to store each particular vegetable and fruit. And I think websites like this are super helpful, because they don't have like a marketing scheme and like a product that they're trying to kind of make you buy. And another good resource is also a lot of the extension work that's being done. I know UF has an extension that part of their extension program focuses on post-harvest. So those kind of websites might also be super useful. I know that UC Davis is very well known for having a lot of resources on this topic. So yeah, a lot of like academic resources can also be very helpful.
Ahmed asks, how will the study help FDA add regulations to improve the areas where the food waste is the most?
How will my study? Well, so my model does quantify how much waste happens at each level. So when we can apply this to at a larger scale, so I'm only looking at Florida tomatoes, but if you can quantify how much waste is happening at each level, then you can know where to invest money in developing interventions and R&D and those kind of research resources for. So I think that's how it can be helpful.
Kelly asks, what do you think about the future of some food waste solutions?
I think a lot of it will be things at the consumer level and retail level. I think it will be more like related to consumer awareness. So people being very resourceful with their food waste. And yeah, like I said, in countries like our own, because most of the waste does happen at the retail and consumer levels, bringing awareness to us, like who are the consumers, I think that will really be something that takes off. And I guess something, I think she's asking for like kind of specific things. So like, I know that there are some food banks that kind of repurpose the food. They kind of like turn it into chutneys and things like that. So I think that will be kind of trendy in the future. So kind of doing the like reprocessing the food and turning it into something else that's a little bit more shelf stable.
And I know you mentioned this a little bit before, but Penny is curious, what are some additional things that we can do to reduce waste on an individual level, or if maybe some of our viewers run companies or restaurants or things like that?
Mm-hmm. So I think as a consumer in general at the retail level, I would say don't be afraid to buy the ugly fruit. Not just at retailers, but also if you're doing one of the U-Picks or if you're at a farmer's market. A lot of the times, if a produce doesn't look pretty or look perfect, we kind of shy away from buying them. Whereas we know that very well inside they have the same content. They just look a little bit different. So I think that's definitely one of the things that as consumers that we can do. And sorry, what was the question again? I feel like I had another answer.
I asked a little bit about whether you own a company or a restaurant or you're an individual, just actions that could be taken.
Oh, let me think. I think it's called like traceability, like actually sharing where your product came from, and kind of where you source your products from. I think that will definitely actually even promote the sales or like the consumers for like buying products from there. Because it's like you want to feel like you're doing something good.
Sure. Next, we have Becca, who asks a question. As you stated earlier, schools are a large source of food waste. Are there any initiatives with any local school districts in order to work to inform consumers, students in this case, or schools to help lower this impact?
I can't really speak to that because I don't work with a lot of the school data. I work mainly on the retail channels. But I know that FDACS, Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, they have done quite a bit of work on reducing food waste in schools through, I'm not sure exactly what it is that they do, but I know that there's a lot of efforts being made into providing Florida grown foods in the schools. I have a friend actually who did research on this topic. So having more locally sourced foods available as school lunches. But I'm not too familiar again with like the school outlets.
Sure. Javina says, we all have a role to play in reducing food waste. How then do you suggest that we share the scientific data with everyone from all walks of life that is consumer friendly?
What is the question? How do you
suggest we share the scientific data in a way that's consumer friendly?
In a way that's consumer friendly. Well, I feel like a lot of companies are doing a really great job at this right now. So basically she's asking about like, how do you educate the consumers in like using science, like showing that, yeah, this tomato may not look perfect, but it's still just as valuable nutrient wise as the perfect looking one. And I think that is going to be one of the key ways to reducing food waste. And yeah, I think just having talks like this, kind of like what you guys are doing right now, educating the general public with people like myself, and then there are several other food waste activists out there who focus on this area, but in a more like academic context. So I think having this kind of collaboration, like using all the academic knowledge from people like myself, and kind of distributing that to the general public. So having more events like this, basically.
All right, well, we have time for just a few more questions. Our next one comes from Amy, who asks, why do you feel we are seeing so little about food waste in the media?
Well, there's a lot of other things going on right now. But I think I've actually started seeing a lot more about food waste ever since COVID happened, because, well, probably because I follow a lot of food related things on social media, but also because COVID has really highlighted the broken parts of our food system. We are having significantly more food losses due to the pandemic. And I think, so for me, it's like even more prevalent. I'm seeing it pop up on like places that I wouldn't normally see it pop up. So I think it has actually increased the awareness of food waste.
Our next question comes from Katie, who asks, does purchasing from small local farms make a difference? As in, does more of their produce make it to market versus industrial farms?
Definitely. Definitely, because, you know, it's just a shorter supply chain, right? You're harvesting it and then you're selling it to your consumer. It's kind of like going to a U-pick, right? So definitely, the shorter the supply chain, the less waste you will have. And that's actually one of the objectives of my research later on, is to show that a more vertically integrated supply chain is more sustainable. And I think in the future, this is also something that I think we might be seeing as more like decentralized food producers and food hubs and things like that. So yeah, instead of like one huge retailer, one huge grower, one huge retailer, we'll be seeing like several decentralized versions of this popping up, because in the end, that does increase food availability and food security. And in the end, it is more sustainable. It's just that I think one of the challenges is kind of linking those kind of people together, because it happens kind of through word of mouth.
And as we begin to wrap up, our last question this evening will be, what gives you hope for the state of our food waste in the future?
That's such a good question. What gives me hope? Well, like I said, like more of this consumer education, more events like this, where you're inviting scientists to share their knowledge, because the best way to learn science is to hear it from a scientist. So I think the fact that you guys at West Palm Beach and Tessie are putting together this series on food, and, you know, kind of making this like collaboration happen, I find that, I mean, that brings me hope, because that shows that, you know, the work that I'm doing is useful and is of interest, and it can make a difference.
Well, Ratna, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie for her to wrap things up with some concluding remarks.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Ratna, so much for that presentation. That wraps up tonight's Climate Conscious Chats, and we hope you've been inspired and can walk away this evening with some small, simple changes that you can make on your own. Again, Ratna, thank you for giving us insight into this whole new world of food waste for many. I know I'm inspired to get out to the green markets in West Palm as soon as they open soon. We'd love for you to follow us and learn more about some of the great programs running within the city of West Palm Beach and around Florida. And we hope to see you again on our October 28th next installment of Climate Conscious Chats, which will be food production. Once again, thank you and have a great night. Bye-bye.